Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Ormond. I work for the Department of Energy Resources at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I just wanted to start by thanking Passive House Institute for the opportunity to be here. It's really my privilege to be able to present our story to you who have been working on Passive House for decades and created a standard that we can adopt. So thank you for doing that. So for those that are unfamiliar with geography of US, Massachusetts is one of the 50 states. We're a geographically small state, but we like to do big things. So decarbonization is one of our big things. So my story really has two chapters. Chapter one is the transformation of our building codes that we underwent. And we transformed them from codes that really focused on energy efficiency to codes that focused on decarbonization, and that's kind of a different thing. And in that chapter, you'll see themes that are familiar to you because you've been working on these for some time, but you'll hear the story from the perspective of state policy, so that's kind of an interesting perspective, I think. And the second part of our story is on the people, and the people that it took to make Passive House and better codes happen in our state. So chapter one begins in 2010, and 2010 was when the state of Massachusetts passed a law that said that our carbon footprint is going to reduce from here to there by 2030, and then from here to there by 2050. So it wasn't an aspiration, it wasn't a goal, it's actually a law. And that's what set everything into motion at that point. And the transformation from energy efficiency codes to decarbonization codes really started in earnest. So the way that we did codes, though, back in 2010 was a lot different than the way that we're looking at them now. And the way that we did codes in 2010, and this is the way a lot of codes are still done all throughout North America, is that what we do is we want to create improvements to our buildings, so we create a theoretical model of a building to a certain standard, and then we take a look at how much energy does that building consume in total, and then we make improvements to that building. We improve the lighting, we improve the fans, or whatever the case may be, and that causes the energy use to go down a little bit, and that's the percent reduction kind of perspective. The total amount of energy went down by 10%, for example, with those improvements, so you get one pat on the back, right? And if you made the total energy go down by 20%, you get two pats on the back. And that's kind of the perspective of energy efficiency in 2010. But one of the challenges with this particular approach was that the foundations of it were sort of weak, right? The foundation of our percent better than approach is based on IECC and iPHA. These are model codes that we use in North America. And so their model codes are national model codes, and then each state can choose to adopt them. So Massachusetts adopts these model codes as well. But those national model codes, they're quite deficient on very particular important things that you as Passive House experts will be extremely familiar with, right? So where are they deficient? It's these four things. I call these the four pillars of good building design because they address the thermal performance of buildings. So for example, the iPHA and IECC model codes in the US, they have essentially no standard for envelope performance. And the reason for that is because they have a pathway in them that allows designers to do energy efficiency measures of any sort. You could improve the lighting or the fans, and then you can take credit for that to water down the performance of the envelope. And there's no limit. So you effectively have no envelope standard in these model codes. They also only recently added any performance standards for air infiltration. There's very, very low standards and very unambitious standards for ventilation energy recovery. In fact, you can build many buildings in the US with no ventilation energy recovery at all. And the one that really bothers me as kind of like a math and science person that cares about buildings is that the model codes in the US do not do anything with respect to thermal bridge. So in the model codes, it actually explicitly states that you can ignore the effect of any Zeegerts, penetrations of any sort through your envelope. And you do not have to derate your envelope in any way, shape, or form, no matter how many penetrations there are. Unbelievable, right? So these are the 4 pillars. So the problem with the framework that we've been using with this sort of percent better, based on this model code foundation, is that you have results like this, right? So everyone's perspective is total energy reduction, how many pats on the back can we get? But if you look under the hood, because the thermal performance of the model code is so weak, what happens is results like this, where your heating load, which is the red, actually didn't get better. So even though it looks like you're making progress, you get 10% reduction, you're actually not making any progress because the thermal performance hasn't actually been improved. But it gets worse, right? Because actually this is like the best outcome in the model codes in the US. And this is actually what often happens, is that because there's no limit to how much we can trade off envelope performance, for example, it is actually a deliberate, explicit design strategy by many designers in the US to do things like improve lighting in order to water down envelope performance. And that's how in the US we have so many buildings that have very low performing curtain wall construction, and they perform very bad from a thermal standpoint. So this is just a kind of an untenuous situation. If your goal is decarbonization, this is just not workable. So in the mid-2010s in Massachusetts, some things changed that really reinforced why this approach was really inadequate. And these will be familiar to you because you've been working on these same things. But again, here's a perspective from state policymakers. So the first thing that happened in the mid-2010s was that we set the stage for huge amounts of offshore wind and huge amounts of solar. So as those things get built, our electric grid gets cleaner and cleaner, and the emissions of our electric grid will go way down. By 2050, the emissions of our electric grid will be much smaller than it is today. So that was kind of change 1 in 2010. And then change 2 in the mid-2010s was that cold climate air source heat pumps became available commercially in Massachusetts for the first time. So Massachusetts has a pretty cold climate. Our design temperatures for winter is -15 degrees Celsius. And so prior to the emergence of cold climate air source, there really was no way to do space heating except for like ground source geothermal, which is hard to do for lots, ubiquitously across all buildings. So when the air source became an option, now we could actually switch from the incumbent use of gas everywhere to air source. So these two things really merged, the cleaning of the grid and the emergence of air source, and they came together to give us a new choice, which is, looks like this. So the old choice, choice 1, is we space heat and we water heat with fossil fuels, right? So if you look at the carbon footprint of that building now and in the future, the carbon footprint will go down because the electric grid's getting better. But if we lock in that gas today, we still have this sort of, this legacy gas even in 2050. But the new choice that we had starting in the 2010s was a choice 2, where we could put the space heating on electric air source and the water heating as well. And now all of the building energy use goes down. So by 2050, the carbon footprint of the building is quite small. So this became sort of an obvious thing to do. Like as policymakers, like everyone was on board with this. Everyone was on board. This was not controversial to now go to what we call electrification of space heating. And so everyone in the universe in Massachusetts, just electrification of space heating, that's the direction we're going to go. Let's go there as soon as possible. But myself as sort of a buildings person, and you know where this is gonna go, right? You know where this is gonna go. The story goes next, is we're looking at the implementation of electrification of space heating, and that's worrisome to someone that is familiar with building dynamics, right? So the way that we used to build buildings under the old model codes that had bad thermal performance would be this scenario here, right? So it's very typical that in Massachusetts, I'm looking at a scenario of a school, and that typically in Massachusetts, we space condition schools so that they have air conditioning. So the peak load on the grid from air conditioning for a typical school might be about 50 kilowatts. And then in the winter, under the old way, we would space heat with gas, so there'd be no load on the grid from space heating. But now if we're going to just simply take the space heating out with gas and replace that with air source space heating, and we still have a bad thermal performance, you know what's gonna happen, right? You know where this is going, is that the winter peak load with the use of electric air source with a bad thermal performing building looks like this. So this is obviously problematic. And as I said, everyone's on board with electrification of space heating, and the utilities that own the grid are like, we're on board with that too. And here's your bill for about 20 billion to quadruple the capacity of Massachusetts grid so we can enable the heating electrification. Thank you very much. So as building scientists, we're looking at this and say, like, you know, where can we go with this, right? And so we got very lucky in Massachusetts because right at about exactly the same time, the thing that you all have been working on for decades showed up in Massachusetts on our shores in a serious way, right exactly at the right moment. So prior to about the mid-2010s, there was a single passive house in Massachusetts. It was a single family home, one single family home passive house in the entire state. And then in the mid-2010s and then later in the 2010s, we had two fantastic projects land on our shores, the Distillery Project and the Winthrop Tower Project, both passive house. And this really gave us an education. We knew about passive house. I just thought it was for single family houses. And then we saw this and we're like, this thing can be done anywhere with any building. We don't have to be on the side of a mountain or something weird. We can put this in downtown Boston. It can be in a tower. So we met the designers of this, we met the engineers of this, and we said, what are you doing? What is it that makes Passive House work so well? Well, lo and behold, what makes Passive House work so well is the four things that our national model code doesn't do well. In fact, it's like the only thing that Passive House is focused on is the only thing that the national model code doesn't focus on. It's almost like a perfect fit in a way. So we realized in Massachusetts that, geez, at a minimum, what we really need to do next to address this problem of decarbonization of space heating is we really have to crush the heating load with these four strategies. We call them the four pillars. So we decided that we're going to change our framework. See, we can't just pull model codes out from everyone, right? Everyone's used to using them. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from a model where we use model codes plus our % better thing. We're going to get away from that. And we're going to go towards the same model codes that everyone's used to, but we'll add 4 amendments, the 4 pillars. So we called this new vision the Massachusetts Thermal Code. We're going to pay attention to thermal performance using those 4 pillars. So we went back and take a look at that school. And because the 4 pillars are so effective at crushing space heating, it means that we can electrify the space heating of that school, and not only is the electric peak load now smaller, just altogether, it's actually smaller than the space cooling load was, right? So now we can go back to the utilities and say, not so fast on 20 billion. We can confidently electrify our space heating in Massachusetts and not have to upgrade our grid, so long as we use our Massachusetts Thermal Code. So we also, in this whole process, we also looked at Passive House itself, okay, when we study, studying schools and offices and residential. And the one thing, so we noticed that our Massachusetts Thermal Code, the way we set it up, performed about the same as Passive House itself for some building types. But there was one special building type that Passive House itself still performed way better than what we were proposing to do with our Massachusetts Thermal Code. And that is large multifamily. So large multifamily, Passive House just really, really crushes those space heating. such that the peak winter load is quite small. And in multifamily is a little different than all the other building types because it uses a lot of water. We really, there's a lot of peak load associated with water heating. We can't get water heating on air source heat pumps readily yet. So we have to do everything possible to really make sure that we're not imposing any loads from space heating from our multifamily projects. So the model that we wanted, the model that we sort of aspired to as policymakers looked like this, that we're going to use for non-residential commercial, we're going to use the model codes plus the 4 pillars, and then if there's any way that we can get passive house in our code for residential, that would be worth it. So this was our vision, this was our goal towards the end of the 2010s. So that brings me to the second chapter of my story, which is people, okay? So it took people to help get this done. And this part of the story, you have to go back to 2010. And in 2010, the state of Massachusetts passed a really great law called the Green Communities Act, the GCA. And the GCA did 2 really effective things to help us bring better codes to our state. The first thing it did was it established a 2-tiered code system. It allowed the Department of Energy Resources, which is us, to create a tiered system of codes. So those tiers, they became known as the base code, which is just the model codes, and then what we call the stretch code, which is the model code plus 2 pats on the back, 20% better. Again, this is back in 2010 before we knew what we were doing. But this was a good model. And the way this would work was that all cities and towns in Massachusetts would have to be on the base code, which is just the model code that everyone's used to, so not controversial. And then the stretch code was the 2 pats on the back, 20% better, and that the cities and towns could decide for themselves and elect and choose to be on the stretch code if they wanted to. So when we proposed this, we had all sorts of special interests come out of the woodwork. And they said, my goodness, how on earth can we do 20% better than the national model code? That's going to be too expensive, too hard, too infeasible, too fill in the blank. The sky is going to fall, and we won't be able to do this. And we said, my goodness, developers, et cetera, we're not making anyone adopt the stretch code. It's just available for them to choose to decide. They are free to choose. Don't you believe in freedom? So that was our stretch code system. The second thing that our Green Communities Act set up was a system whereby all 251 cities and towns in Massachusetts would hire a sustainability coordinator for the city or town. And that sustainability coordinator would then go out and find 10 people to form a sustainability committee. So who are these people in this committee, and who are these sustainability coordinators? Well, it's like retirees, firemen, students, teachers, just regular old citizens that cared about the climate. They cared about sustainability. So the first thing that we did was we went to those sustainability coordinators and those committees, and we said to them, your first mission is to research building codes, to look at the base code and look at the stretch code, and make a recommendation to your city and town whether that town should adopt the stretch code options. Totally up to you. You get to decide. And what we were doing in that process is 10 people per committee times 251 towns is, thousands, 2,551, whatever, people that cared about sustainability transformed to people that cared about buildings because we gave them that particular mission. So now we have this network of citizen advocates throughout our whole state working locally in their cities and towns. And what are they working on? They're working on building codes. So we also asked them, in addition to decide on this vote, we just want to make sure the vote went the right way. So he said, if you do decide to do the stretch code in your city and town, you'll be eligible for grants to improve your municipal buildings as well. So this was a really effective strategy, the stretch code strategy. Within a few years, pretty much the entire state of Massachusetts adopted the stretch code, which was the thing that was going to make the sky fall. Well, the sky didn't fall, and all these things went into place. So when we saw our new vision for what we wanted our code to do, we had this long history of using stretch codes to do more ambitious things. So what we wanted to move our code toward in 2022 to solve this decarbonization of space heating thing was, just a reminder, so base code is model, right? And then stretch code is model code. And what we wanted to do was, again, take out the % better and put in the 4 pillars. And that would be the stretch code. That's the Massachusetts thermal code, okay? And then we're racking our brains, how do we get Passive House itself, at least for residential, into our code? So we came up with something clever. I didn't come up with this. One of my peers did. They said, why don't we create a 3rd tier? And we'll call it the specialized tier. So now all the cities and towns can choose to go from the stretch to the specialized. It's up to them. They get to vote on it. We don't tell them to do it, okay? So once again, all the special interests came out of the woodwork and said, my goodness, we can't have Passive House actually be mandatory in our code. And we said, well, look, we're not actually making anyone adopt this. This is just available to adopt. If someone chooses to, they're free to decide if they want to be on the specialized code and make Passive House mandatory. Don't you believe in freedom? So we put the specialized and we put electrification readiness into Passive House and electrification readiness into the specialized. And so history repeating itself. Remember that we have literally thousands of citizen advocates that have been working on building codes for years now. Well, they know what Passive House is. They know what thermal code is, and they are ready to adopt it. So within 6 months of becoming available, we had every single major city in Massachusetts has already adopted the specialized. And it's not in spite of Passive House, it's because of Passive House that they're adopting specialized, because they want that Passive House in their code. So I'll end with this. We get approached by states all over the United States, and they say, what can we do to make better codes in our state? And I say, there's really 3 things you have to do. The first thing you have to do is you have to put the 4 pillars on top of the model codes that you already have adopted. Because the model codes are here. And if you just adopt these 4 pillars, you're gonna get to about here. And Passive House is right here. And so you're gonna bridge that gap between where you are to Passive House. You're gonna close that gap considerably by just adopting the thermal 4 pillars. And the second thing is, you need to create citizen advocates. It's very easy for you to find thousands of people that are interested in sustainability. They want to solve the global warming crisis. So you need to transform them into people interested in sustainability, into people interested in building codes. And then the last thing you need to do is to create tiers, optional tiers, so that this is the mandatory one. No one can argue with, everyone agrees we should do that. And then make a tier that's more ambitious. And then allow the citizen advocates to choose for themselves to be on that tier. And that gives you the ability to do more ambitious things. So thank you very much for the chance to be here and present this to you today. Really appreciate it.